Hi everyone, thank you. Thanks very much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be here and speak with all of you. So quick bit about myself. I've spent the best part of the last decade working with electric vehicles in one form or another. I've worked with a number of racing teams in FIA Formula E. I've worked with some EV manufacturers and some autonomous vehicle manufacturers as well. And then since moving to Ireland, I created the Irish EVs website. So what is Irish EVs? Ultimately, we're a consumer website. We're entirely independent. We don't have any advertisers. So our focus is very much on giving the best advice possible with no bias. We're really focused on trying to educate people and to show cars in the context of the climate crisis. So obviously we know around 20% of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions come from the transport sector. So we're trying to put cars in that context, and we feel that particularly at the moment, the media isn't representing that as well as it could do. And then another factor for us is confronting myths. So whether that's greenwashing or confronting a lack of education, which obviously has come up a lot today, and even just common misconceptions. I know there was a survey in 2019 in the UK that found around about 12% of people didn't think you could drive an electric car in the rain. So obviously there's a lot of work for us to do there, and we want to play our part in doing that. So obviously, as everyone has discussed today, Ireland has a really ambitious goal of 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. And as Simon's covered in his sort of overview of the last year, there's a lot of reason to be very positive. We've seen a lot of improvements in the sales of EVs. There's clearly a real hunger for them, and particularly in battery electric vehicles, to see a rise of around 16% year on year, despite the actual overall car sales in Ireland dropping by 25%. That's a huge year-on-year improvement, which is great. But the big question is, how do we go from around 30,000 vehicles to this 1 million? So moving on to the next slide, I think one of the things we've seen in the past has been that the Irish government has really prioritised scrappage schemes. And while that has worked well in the past in getting people from sort of outdated high emissions vehicles into newer, slightly lower emissions vehicles, it also creates a huge amount of waste. Scrappage schemes typically take cars that run absolutely fine. They're perfect for everyday runarounds. They're just high emissions, but ultimately they still have a role to play. And while we have seen there's been a lot of improvements as well made in the reuse of the materials from scrapped vehicles, it's really important to bear in mind that it's still an incredibly energy intensive process. You need to rip apart all of the components of the car. You need to then process them and melt them down. And this is hugely energy intensive and just creates more waste. And the stat that I hope will shock you as much as it did me, in a typical year, we tend to scrap around 160,000 cars in Ireland each year. So we're creating a vast amount of waste already. But we think there's a solution to that. So coming on to the next slide, there is a growing industry for EV conversions. So what do we mean by EV conversion? Simply taking a petrol, diesel or hybrid car and then converting it to run as a battery electric vehicle. I'm sure if you've seen any of these cars so far, they've probably been quite high-end, quite classic cars, lots of lovely Ferraris and even Mini Coopers and things. But there is a real market for everyday runabout vehicles, and we think there's a huge amount of potential here. So we're seeing more and more organizations and companies offering lower end conversions. And we're also seeing more and more training courses for mechanics and enthusiasts to convert their cars as well. But it's not just cars, it's trucks, tractors, ambulances, boats even. Anything that runs with an ICE engine can effectively become a battery electric vehicle. And we think that there are huge opportunities here in the next few years. So moving on to the next slide, how does EV conversion work? The good news is that it's actually relatively simple. It typically comes in two forms. One is standalone. That's taking your own particular vehicle and customizing it exactly as you want. And that tends to be a bit more expensive. But then there are also kits too. And kits can be made mass produced. They can also be open source, and that can really drive down the cost and make it accessible to more and more people. In terms of the actual process for conversion itself, it's pretty easy. It's taking all the parts that make an ICE, so the engine, the catalytic converters, the fuel tanks, removing those and replacing them with an inverter, motors, and batteries. Even things like the gearboxes can remain in the vehicle. You can actually use these and make them functional. And one thing that we think is a particular sort of benefit at the moment is those parts that we're taking out of the vehicle can actually be sold off for spare parts. We know that there's a huge problem with catalytic converter crime in Ireland at the moment. So you can see the huge amount of demand there for the components that we're removing from the cars. So you can actually sell these off and cover part of the costs. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. We know there's a lot of confusion about registration, and this is something that a lot of people fear when it comes to EV conversion. But the really good news is that this is actually a pretty solid process. It's been done by a lot of people, and we know how it works now in Ireland. In fact, we recommend going to openinverter.org. There's a whole guide on how to process and register your converted EV there. Being very sort of giving a quick summary in such a short period of time, the process is to get an automotive engineer on board. Once you've done the conversion, they'll come and check that everything is safe, secure, as it should be, and meets all of the right specifications. And if it does, they'll give you a certification to say this vehicle is now an EV. So the second you get that, you can re-register it purely as an electric vehicle. And from that moment onwards as well, regardless of what it had before, it registers for the €120 road tax as well, which is great. And then also from then on, it's still treated just as an EV. So things like your NCT test, it would go in for that exactly as any new EV would. So there shouldn't be any confusion or any new processes or hoops to jump through. One thing that we would say is contact your insurance in advance. We know that the insurance industry has kind of dragged its feet on electric vehicles anyway. Now, there's no reason your insurance should go up for it being an EV, but we recommend just having a chat with them in advance. It's something that will save a bit of pain later on. And then on the next slide, the big question that I'm sure everyone has, which is cost. How much does it cost? The really good news is obviously, if you are using a car already, you have the largest cost there anyway. You're not having to buy a new one in effect. So at the moment, it's a pretty simple conversion. Speaking to those who do it in Ireland today, we see that the costs range from about 2 to 5k, and that will give you about 80 to 100 kilometers range. But we expect in the next sort of 3 to 5 years that will really improve. So we think in about 2 to 3 years, perhaps we'll be looking at about 5k, and that will give you 240 kilometers to 320 kilometers, and that includes parts and labor. So in relatively short order, we think you'll be able to have an EV conversion that has around the standard range of a new EV on the road today. One of the big factors in that is the production of kits. So speaking to Kevin Sharp of New Electric, he thinks that with more and more kits becoming available, it should be possible to convert an EV in around half a day. So that's obviously going to be a huge reduction in cost there in terms of labour. The two factors that we say keep in mind the most are batteries and fast charging. These are the two biggest costs that you can have. Of course, a lot of people will want to look at hundreds and hundreds of kilometers range as they do with new EVs. We say just look at the one that you need now. And of course, we know that there's a huge new market for range extender batteries as well. And I think this is where there's huge potential to make your car modular. You can upgrade it as you go. So in the same way that you buy a new EV at the moment and the software changes over time and you get more range, we think that there's a huge opportunity to take what you have now and keep developing it over the years and reduce a massive amount of waste. I'm conscious that that is an incredibly quick fly through of a very complex subject. So I've just got one more slide for everyone, which is just some recommended reading, really. Some organizations and some resources that we think will be helpful. New Electric, they're doing some amazing work. They started in the Netherlands. They were operating in Ireland, and I think sadly due to the pandemic, they won't be any longer, which will be very sad, but we recommend going and reading them. Fikra Cook has done a great job of cataloging the conversion of his Audi and how he's converted that across. And he's done a lot in terms of how you register these vehicles as well. So we recommend going and checking him out on Twitter. Damien Maguire as well is doing amazing work with open source. So he's hacking Tesla and all sorts of bits like that. which is a brilliant thing to go and see. There's Kevin Sharp, who's of the aforementioned New Electric. He's a real expert in this field and has been driving EVs himself for over a decade. And then hopefully there's us as well, Irish EVs. We have 2 articles on this very topic. So we have one which is how electric car conversion works, which goes into what we've discussed today in a lot more detail. And then there's also incentivizing EV conversion, so how we can hopefully encourage the government to move away from scrappage schemes and get more people to see cars as resources that we can recycle and reuse. Anyway, there we are. I know we're sort of running behind today, so I hope that was a informative, helpful, quick run through.